I call to order the meeting of the Committee of the Whole on January 28th, 2026 at 6:30 p.m. The first item is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next is roll call. Administrator Brecklin, can you help us out?
Absolutely. Good evening, all. Mayor Arata-Frada. Here. Alder Dantzler Jr.
Here.
Alder Gerhardt.
Here.
Alder Herbst.
Here.
Alder Jetzer.
Here.
Alder Laduse.
Here.
Alder Lepper.
Here.
Alder Maldonado is delayed at this time. And Alder Reichstad.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you so much. Next, we have the approval of minutes. I'll need a motion on the draft minutes of the November 17th, 2025 Committee of the Whole meeting.
So move. Second.
Motion to approve by Alder Dancer, second by Laduse. Comments or questions? Seeing none, all in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Next item is 5, public appearances for non-agenda items. We have nobody in chambers or online that's registered for non-agenda items, so we can move on to our agenda items. We have one tonight, passive buildings presentation. Joining us here is Christy Weber, architect and certified FIAS consultant, owner of Centerline Architecture, and Sean Size, construction manager with Threshold Development Group. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing more about passive buildings.
Thank you. Are we ready to go?
Please start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Am I close enough to the microphone? This is a unique experience for me. I've never presented in this capacity before. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it. My name is Christy Weber. As Gabriella said, I am an architect. I'm the president of the FIAS Alliance Wisconsin, and I'll tell you a little bit about more what that means in a little bit. And I'm also a FIAS certified consultant. And you'll figure out what that means as well. This is Sean Size. He works for Threshold Builds, which is a company that has a suite of companies, a development arm, a design arm, an equity arm, and a sacred arm, and the build arm. Yep. So he's going to be available for questions. He was integral to the construction of 252 Dunning in Madison, which is Wisconsin's first certified multifamily market rate passive building. So my background is residential design. I'm not in commercial, I'm not in multifamily, so I'm going to just let you know that right away. But I've been a passive house consultant or FIAS certified consultant since 2012, so I've learned quite a bit about passive building principles, and I'm really excited to share with you all. So let's get into it. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is these 6 items. What is FIAS Alliance Wisconsin and FIAS? Why a passive building? Why would we do this? What are the benefits? What is a passive building? How do we do it? So the principles, sort of the core information behind it. What's up in Wisconsin? I'll talk about 252 Dunning a little bit, and what are other states doing, programs, incentives, things like that. So, okay, so FIAS is an acronym, or it used to be an acronym. It used to stand for Passive House Institute U.S. They have since rebranded, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that soon. But they are sort of the national force behind passive buildings in the U.S. The Alliance is a sister organization. Basically, there are different chapters around the country. Wisconsin has one. We started it in 2018. It's relatively small, but we're growing just a little bit at a time every year. So we love to grow that membership even further and continue working to get the word out about passive buildings. It's worth noting that FIAS National is involved with these organizations that are up here on the screen, USDOE, Rocky Mountain Institute, and Building Science Corp. Especially noteworthy is the USDOE, and I'll show you a little diagram later that explains what the USDOE thinks of passive house. And they've rebranded recently, going from Passive House Institute US to FIAS because the word passive house is a little bit misleading because it can apply to all buildings. So we're trying to fix that. Okay, so first thing, Why a passive building? Why would we do this? Energy and emission reductions is the first thing on my list. We are seeing impacts from climate change. We are going to continue to see that. Reducing our overall energy use is going to put us in a better spot to combat those issues. I also think about it as the fastest track to net zero or beyond, net positive, and I will talk about that in a little bit more detail later as well. Unmatched comfort. These buildings feel really good to be in. No drafty rooms, no cold walls, even sitting next to a window feels wonderful. And it's because of the envelope that's created by the passive building. And they're also amazingly quiet. My favorite story is one from New York. I was watching this video of, I think it was the builder or the architect who was doing this tour, and they were standing outside on the busy street, loud honking horns and people, and they walk into the passive building and shut the door, and it's like whisper quiet. That's my favorite story. They're very, very wonderful to be in, very quiet. Healthy indoor air quality is the third one. As we tighten up our buildings, we need to have constant filtered fresh air running through them. People need to breathe, not buildings, people. It produces virtually allergen-free air, it reduces particulates. I think it's gonna help us a lot with any wildfire smoke that we're kind of seeing. We had that instance last year and the year before. So that should be something that can help out with that. And also just better occupant well-being. We need fresh air, we do better with it. Fourth one, resilient, durable, and built to last. We use the best practices in building envelope design. So yes, we're talking about reducing the energy that we use. We're talking about having better indoor air quality, but we're also concerned with water management. Bulk water, also vapor management, basically water as vapor on air, moving into a wall assembly. We want to build buildings that last, not just reduce energy, not just better indoor air quality, but also something that can last for decades. We also see third-party control or quality control with these buildings. If you go through FIA's certification, you will have someone as a part of your team that will be doing the third-party quality control and making sure that it gets built the way that it was designed. Energy independence is the fourth one. So energy prices they're on the rise. They will continue to rise. That will vary over time and across the country, but the fact is that they're not going down. Reduced dependency on the grid with major power outages and things like that. These buildings tend to coast through a shorter outage, meaning that they are so well insulated and air sealed that even if you didn't have heat for a couple days, you could be comfortable in it. Might even be more than a couple days. I have plenty of anecdotes about that, but I won't go into it now. Less infrastructure required by utilities, so as we continue to grow and as we build more buildings, if we're reducing our loads and putting less pressure on the grid, they won't have to beef up their infrastructure and spend quite as much money. Less renewable energy required to get to zero. I'll talk more about that later on. And then financially smart. Lower operating costs is the obvious sort of first thing. They also tend to sell faster and rent faster and have a higher value. It also frees up funds for a higher purpose. There's the Rethke Terrace in Madison, which is a commercial FIA certified building. It is transitional housing. They have been able to take the savings from lower operating costs and divert it to the people that are moving through their program. So they have more money for services because they're spending less on energy. So that's why. I hope that was convincing. So let's move forward. I always like to mention this. It's kind of fun. Comes in any flavor. People have asked me many times, like, oh, does it have to look a certain way or be a certain way? And I say, no. It can be any style that you want. Here's a bunch of houses that are kind of making that example for me. Multifamily, most of these projects are from either coast, but there is just a whole range of styles that you can apply. You don't have to be limited by one. Also worth mentioning, offices, schools, churches, FIA certification can apply to any of these. That building on the lower in the middle is actually the first certified building in the country that's commercial, up in Bemidji, Minnesota, so one of the hardest climates to design in. And then even high rises are starting to come online, being FIA certified. So I've told you about the benefits. What is it? In its simplest form, it's an integrated building design and construction concept that employs building science fundamentals to attain high levels of comfort, durability, energy efficiency, indoor health, and resiliency. So you can see down at the bottom on the left, it's a set of design and construction principles that we're going to get into in just a minute. Together, when applied, along with quality assurance, results in a certification. So it's two things. It's a set of design and construction principles and a certification program. I talk about it being the smartest way to zero or net positive because I believe it is. The conservation first approach is really near and dear to the whole FIAS program. It says it provides energy savings of 40 to 60% compared to conventional buildings, but that's really, what are you comparing it to? What is a conventional building? One that was built a couple years ago on the 2015 code is going to be a little bit different than the one that's built next year on the 2021 commercial code. But that's not what's important on this slide. I think what's important is if there's anything that you take away from tonight, I would say it's this idea of the conservation first approach. We first drive down our heating and cooling and electrical loads as much as we possibly can before fancy systems, before solar. So why is it called passive? I always think of it as like this building is passively resisting its environment. It's able to stand on its own without the solar, with sometimes in the case of emergency, potentially without any heat input, although we do not want that. So the conservation first approach is the most important aspect, I would say. These are nice graphics, kind of seeing a conventional building and the amount of energy reduction that you would see in a passive building. Here's what the Department of Energy says. The last time I checked, this was on their website. They think of FIAS as kind of the gold standard. They have this graphic that they share. IECC 2006 would have been the 2006 Energy Code, so quite a few years ago now, that being their baseline down below. And this idea of a stepping stone, that Energy Star was a notch up, and then DOE, Zero Energy Ready Home, and those programs were the next step, and FIAS Core and FIAS Zero being the certifications that are the gold standard. This comes from the Department of Energy. Not to bore you with too much history, but I do like to mention, because I find it to be a source of pride, it always brings a smile to my face to think about how these principles are rooted in the Midwest. A lot of the idea of passive solar or super insulation and things like that, they came out of research done in Illinois, in Canada, and in Wisconsin. And all of this was happening early in the 70s and a little bit into the 80s. But at some point, there wasn't as much interest, or people weren't paying attention as much because the energy crisis was over. But the Germans, they still felt the need to conserve energy. And they actually gathered up all their research and all of our research, and they developed the Passive House program. That's Dr. Feist and Dr. Adamson, who I mentioned here on this timeline. Kat Klingenberg, who is the leader of FIAS, she was working for them at the time, and she brought these principles to the back to the U.S. and started the Passive House Institute U.S. at the time. I'm just going to flip to the next slide and talk about that next piece on the timeline, climate specific and cost optimized. So when Passive House standard first came out of Germany, the focus was very much on the climate zone that Germany had, which is more like maybe southern Illinois or central Illinois. But what Kat and those folks over at FIAS found over time was that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So they started developing the climate-specific standard. What they were seeing is folks in maybe California or down south in Texas, they were able to meet the passive standard, but they were leaving all this kind of affordable energy savings on the table, and it was like too easy. And then up in the north, in our zone, up in Climate 7, in Alaska, it was almost too hard. So we ended up doing things like putting too many windows in, and then we're overheating in the summer. Or we're getting to, for a house, 12 inches of insulation. I'm still not quite meeting it with the energy model, so I add 3 or 4 inches more, and you're looking at diminishing returns kind of when you get to that point, and they recognize that. So they were looking at that, and they were also looking at the cost optimization. Their approach is to set the standard just over the knee. So that means that it's just a little bit better than that financial sweet spot, but before you hit that moment of diminishing returns in the investment, whether it be insulation or air sealing or whatever. So that's what kind of created these climate-specific standards. And it also puts buildings like this into that resiliency category where they're durable for the long term and they can swing through potential power outages. The other thing that's important to note is the quality aspect. The program leads a project team through everything that they need to do to maintain quality. Design, there's an iterative review process, so while you're in the design phase, you're back and forth with the FIAS certification team to develop and further develop your design and continue to meet the program goals as much as you possibly can. And there's an energy model that goes with it. There's a proprietary software that is used that comes out of Germany, and it's got proven and highly predictive results. They've actually tested it. The thing from Germany is that they tested it many times, and in the beginning they were wondering why their performance didn't match up with their energy modeling, and what they found was thermal bridging was the cause. And once they fixed that problem, they were seeing the results. So they've very much compared the energy models to actual operation. And then you get design certified before construction even starts. So it's like a pre-certification. And then in construction, you have careful implementation of critical details to meet your performance targets. And that's really important. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And there's the third-party verification. So you'd have a person that's a verifier involved. And you also do blower door testing. And you don't get final certification until all of that is complete. They also consider source energy. So it's not just about what you're using at your location in your building, it's also about what the line losses or the distribution inefficiencies that are coming. So there's a multiplier in the software that you have to apply based on what energy source you're using. Okay, so now I'm gonna get into how to do a passive building. How do you put it together? And it gets a little technical. I'm gonna try to stay as high level as possible, but I think it's important to present these main principles at a high level so you can kind of understand what goes into a FIAS building or passive building. So the 4 of them are thermal control, air control, solar radiation control, and moisture control. So with thermal control helps keep the inside warmer when it's cold outside and cooler when it's hot outside to maximize comfort and energy. Seems pretty simple. That's what insulation does. So we're going to talk about the high performance enclosure and thermal bridges. So the thermal enclosure, the insulation, so nature kind of teaches us that continuous insulation actually decreases heat loss. For example, this bird is able to pull itself all the way inside of its feathers and have this warm blanket all around itself. So that's continuous insulation. Imagine if there was a hole in those feathers, that would be an amount of heat loss that perhaps a bird could not afford in the middle of winter. And we have to kind of think like that when we think about buildings. So what we want to see is continuous insulation. Nowadays we build things and it has insulation, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's continuous. For example, where we're having walls meet floors, walls meet windows, or a wall meet the slab, these are these moments that are really challenging because you have to make sure that that layer is actually continuous. And I always like to tell people that take a building section, so this would be architects mostly, but take a building section, put your pencil or your marker or whatever down, and try to draw that thermal envelope layer. And if you ever have to pick up your pencil, you know that you have a gap, you know that you have like a moment that you have to solve. So that's a good trick to understand this. And then the other piece is thermal bridging, so you might ask what that is. It's basically when a material is touching both the inside and the outside of the building, it's able to conduct heat through. So for example, this house, the picture on the left is with no continuous insulation on the exterior, and you can really see the studs. You can see how every single stud is conducting heat out of that building. Whereas on the right, and this is not a passive building necessarily on the right, it's just like a better building. They put a couple of inches of foam on the exterior, and you can see that the thermal bridging and the heat loss through the studs is greatly reduced, and it's even better at the cavity between the studs. There are many ways of achieving thermal bridge-free construction. This is just one. The other thing to think about, which is really important, is mold risk. When you have a thermal bridge, that area is cold. Like, go home tonight and put your hand up against the wall. You will feel that it's cold, and there's probably some areas that are colder than others. The notorious one is like behind the shelving unit, where like nobody ever goes, or behind the couch. And when you have a thermal bridge and it's incredibly cold and you have warm, moist air, ends up condensing upon that surface, and that can cause mold. It can cause mold on the surface, or potentially it's causing mold inside the walls or your floor system, and that's not good for anybody. It's not good for humans. We don't like mold, we get sick around it, and it's really not good for the building either. I mean, nobody wants to have a building that's rotting. And then finally, I like to talk about windows and doors. So I'll be talking about windows in 3 different ways tonight. Right now we're talking about the thermally broken aspect of it. So this window, as an example, has 3 gaskets that are circled by the red circles there. So what this means when this window closes is because it has these gaskets, it's actually very airtight. And what we've seen over time is that any window that sort of slides, double hung or a slider, not so great. So usually we're looking at things like casements, awnings. This happens to be a tilt turn, but something that can really shut and sort of suck down all the way around the perimeter. So I'm getting into air tightness a little bit here, but the windows are very important. There's many aspects to look at. The thermally broken part is thermally breaking the frame, so you don't have conduction of heat through the frame, and then also the triple pane aspect of these windows that we're looking at here, more insulation because it's triple pane, you have 2 air spaces. One more thing about thermal control is compact shape. The more compact your shape is, the less heat loss you'll have. So when I talk to designers, when I'm talking to them about the design of a passive building, try to keep your shape as compact as possible. So every time you make a jog or a jig, or you want to think about, like, is this intentional? What purpose is this serving? And often, we do need a few of those, but trying to minimize them in order to reduce surface area and reduce heat loss is a really good way to go, especially in our cold climate. So that was thermal control. Now let's look at air control. So passive buildings achieve air control by air sealing the enclosure and then providing balanced mechanical ventilation to achieve superior indoor air quality. So we'll look at air tightness and ventilation. First off, air tightness. Air infiltration can account for up to half of a building's heat loss. So it's not just about that continuous layer of insulation. It's also about that continuous airtight layer. Same strategy. Take a building section, put your pencil down. Every time you have to pick your pencil up, you've got a problem that you need to now solve through, creative detailing. So whenever there is some sort of air leak, that's contributing to your heat loss. So it's really important to have a airtight layer. And here's some examples. So when we start to get really airtight, every little other hole tries to force that much more air through it. So we have to get really detailed about what we do. So upper left picture is an example of sealing an interior air barrier right to the window with a high performance tape. Or if you look at the bottom right, actually most of the pictures on the bottom, except for the middle one, are showing moments where there are penetrations through the envelope. Things like wiring, a line set, or up at the top there's a sump pump, for example. We want to seal all of these things to the air barrier so we can have that continuous air barrier all the way around the envelope. The other part that I like to mention is with air control, educating your team, your construction team, and all the subcontractors, because they're all going to have an interaction with this at some point. But the air barrier is precious, and we need to let them know not to hurt it and how to interact with it. And also, we always do blower door tests before insulation and finishes so that we know what the air tightness is before we close it all up and we can't get to it anymore. So we'll do it where we can still access the places where that's our airtight layer and add additional tape or sealant or whatever we need to close that up. And then air control for our fresh air. So just to reiterate, buildings don't need to breathe, but people do. We evolved to breathe fresh air. But we have all this air in our building we just heated, right? We heated it with the sun or our internal gains or with our mechanical systems. We don't want to just throw all that heat away. That would be really silly, right? So what we do is we use an ERV, an energy recovery ventilator. So we're taking the stale, warm air from the house or the building and sending it out. And we're bringing in fresh, often in Wisconsin, cold air. And this ERV, basically, it doesn't mix the air, but it has a mechanism that moves the heat from the outgoing air into the incoming air so that we're not throwing all the heat away, but we are introducing fresh air. All right, third one, solar radiation. So controlling solar radiation is key for optimized design and preventing overheating in passive buildings. FEAS optimized buildings balance solar radiation, taking advantage of it when needed and shading when not, to lighten the cooling load and maximize energy efficiency. So we're going to look at glazing and shading. So here is that passive solar principle. I can't remember if I mentioned it or not, but people definitely got confused with like passive solar, passive house, what's the difference? Well, passive solar is using the sun's heat to heat the inside of your house. That's basically what it is in a nutshell. So we do use that as one of a package of principles, and here it is. So in this diagram on the right, we're seeing that at the winter solstice, when the sun is lowest in the sky, we're introducing heat into the house. That means your loads are lower. You don't need to use mechanical heat as much because you're using the sun as part of that. And then we have to have an overhang or some sort of shading element. So in the summer, when the sun is high, we don't introduce that heat, obviously, because we're trying to cool. So there's a lot of shading strategies. Anything from a front porch or some cool sliding panels or some canopies, louvers, slats, and the list kind of goes on. And what I love about the shading is that, you've done this thing where you've created like a box, like a nice little compact box, but it doesn't have any interest, right? It's just sort of plain. So shading is one of those ways that we can start to introduce some architectural interest without increasing the surface area through lots of jogs in the envelope. And then finally, the high performance glazing, I mentioned the triple pane, but there's another factor that we consider, and it's solar heat gain coefficient. And what that is how much of the sun's heat is the glass itself, because this glass has coatings on it. How much is it letting in, and how much is it keeping out? So remember when we had all those incentives for more energy efficient windows, a little ways back? That was great. However, most of the windows that they were kind of calling for, they were thinking about on a national scale. So they had very low solar heat gain coefficients, and that's awesome for Florida or Arizona. But up here, we really do want to use the sun's heat as much as we can. So we want to look at a higher solar heat gain coefficient, like 50%, as opposed to maybe 30 or less for a project that would be down south.
Is there such a thing as like a glazing that you put on that takes advantage of direct sunlight but doesn't take advantage of more glancing sunlight? Some kind of prismatic.
I am not aware of that. I would think that would be done through like mechanical means.
Okay.
But sometimes people will tune their windows, meaning that on the south side, they'll have a higher solar heat gain coefficient, and on the north side, they'll choose a low one because you're never getting sun on the north side. So that would be one way to sort of, balance it.
Designing physical shading.
Yeah, and designing physical shading definitely is important. Oh, so now we'll talk about moisture control. Passive buildings require special attention to moisture control, both in proper vapor and moisture control design for the enclosure, as well as the mechanical systems needed to maintain appropriate moisture levels. So we're going to talk about material moisture and air humidity in this one. So there's a very egregious example of mold. Most of us don't ever experience that. But as I said before, mold and rot is really not great for people. And we think about this in terms of vapor, but it's also important to think about bulk water. I see driving around such a wide variety of quality. The one that I see most of the time is, Tyvek house wrap, kind of like flapping in the wind. And I really worry about the materials that are getting wet and if they're going to have the opportunity to dry out. So it's really important, whether you're doing FIA certification or you're just your average architect, to be thinking very carefully about how to manage bulk water. And what I mean is rainwater when I say that, like the water on the outside. We also have the water on the inside that's on our air when we take a shower from plants or from breathing. We want to minimize vapor diffusion into the wall assembly. And if any gets in, we want to make sure it has a way to get out. I would say from a building science perspective, this is the most complicated topic. It's challenging to understand, even for building professionals, and I could get really, really technical and a bit geeky, but I will spare you tonight. And then the other thing we want to think about is humidity. I think the main point I want to make here is that people get really excited about the heating load is low and the cooling load is low, and we've done such a good job. And then there are stories of buildings here in the Midwest who are like, but I still am struggling with dehumidification. And it's true. We live in Wisconsin where the summers are hot and humid. So it's interesting because even though we may not have much heating and cooling to do, we still have to deal with humidity. So that's really important to consider. So those are the principles in a nutshell: the thermal, air, radiation, and moisture. And then when you combine with the energy modeling and the quality control and just a darn good team, you will be able to get a FIA certified building. So now I want to talk about what's been happening in Wisconsin. So like with anything, the cool stuff seems to start on the coasts. So Pacific Northwest in California, they've got a lot going on with this. New England, I'm looking at them a lot. They're closer to our climate zone than the folks out west, and they're doing a lot of work as well. Little bit slower, but it's just bit by bit coming into the Midwest. And we have a handful of houses, which are shown on this slide, that have been certified, and the Rethke Terrace is there in the upper middle part. That was our first commercial certified building in Madison. And then we have Dunning, which I'll talk about next. And we have the Bayview Community Center, which is, I believe, still awaiting its final approval. They were going for FIAS 0, so they had to get their solar installed. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about Dunning. So I have Sean here. That fifth team member on that line is Threshold Builds, and they were the air sealing specialist team, and Sean headed that up. He also worked very closely with Knothy and Bruce to work through some key insulation and air sealing details. But the project team generally was Threshold Development, Knothy and Bruce Architects. There was the Passive House, or FIAS professional from Onion Flats in Pennsylvania. Krupp Construction was the contractor, and then Threshold Builds was air sealing. So it's noteworthy that we have people in Dane County who are doing this. Krupp learned a lot on this project. Hopefully they'll be able to pair up again. Threshold Builds is building their own multifamily projects now, so the resources are there. This project was certified last October. So some stats, it's a 32 unit, 22 one beds and 10 two beds. They have 32 parking spaces in the ramp below the building, which is not a part of the thermal envelope. The thermal envelope of the passive building is just those 3 floors. They did really well on their blower door test. I know those numbers may not mean anything to you, but they're excellent. Hard costs are there. Actual versus budget, $8.33 million for the actual. And they took about 12 months to construct. And in terms of rents, they filled up really quickly. I think by the time it was certified, they had 100% capacity. So then I kind of looked up what the rents were, and they were all including all the utilities and even internet. So you kind of have to back that out of the rents. I'm not exactly sure how much those numbers would be for a 1 or 2 bedroom unit. But you can kind of approximate, maybe it's 200, 250. $1,695 to $2,245 for the 1 bedroom, and $2,500 to $3,450 for the 2. And that was the first year of rents. All the rents vary based on size and floor level. The parking isn't necessarily guaranteed, but there is parking available. And all of the units have balconies, which I think is really great. And this is in like a cute little quiet neighborhood on the east side. So it felt appropriate to me. I did bring the handouts. I think everybody has one. I have more here if you have a friend that you want to share it with. But this is what we shared when we did 2 tours, when some of the units were actually open back in August, September. So we handed these out, just some additional information about the building. And moving forward in Wisconsin, obviously I want to see more of these. And I think it's great. Like, I'm very grateful to you all for having invited us here to talk about this. I have been doing this since 2012, and to see interest growing now is really exciting. I see every conventional building that gets built as a missed opportunity. I understand why they get built. There are realities that we have to face. But I think moving forward, we can learn a lot about what we can do to not have to build conventional buildings. Are we going to see this in 30 years? Maybe a building lasts 50 years. Are we going to replace it with something better then? Or can we just do it now? Let's figure it out. Municipalities, like yourself, have the opportunity to assemble your own set of tools to drive development of these new buildings. So I want to talk about them. First, I'm going to say I am not a policy expert by any means. It is something I've been learning about a lot in the last year. The FIAS is going to be, they're actually going to be developing a committee for policy stuff, so we'll learn a lot more and be able to share that information. And I have a feeling that I will be suckered into joining that committee, but I will be happy to do so. It's something I want to learn a lot more about. So I'm going to get into this. very high level. It's going to be, up to you and others to kind of look into these different things. And I'm happy to connect you. Sean and I are connected with many different types of people, from government to developers to the folks at FIAS. So we can definitely connect you with others. And maybe you could even bring a couple in for presentations. So having said that, let's get into this. So direct incentives tied to certification. So they can be done at the state or the municipal level. One excellent example is Mass Save in Massachusetts. They are doing a great job. They have incentives to offset the cost of design and building. So that might be something like hiring your FIAS consultant, or your architect, needs to take a couple classes to brush up on this and things like that. And then they also have incentives for feasibility studies, so you can go ahead and do the right planning to make sure that this is going to work out, the energy modeling, and then also the cost of certification. And then other examples besides Massachusetts: California, Connecticut, Austin, Texas, New York, and Rhode Island are all engaging in programs like this.
And can I just clarify, so Austin, Texas is a city
Yes.
program, and the
Yes.
rest of them are statewide programs?
Yes. In this case, New York's is a state program, but there are some things that New York City specifically is also doing in addition.
Yeah, it's just good to see a city on that list.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yep. And you'll see some more too. Electrification and high efficiency incentives, so not directly related to FIAS certification, but a FIAS building would qualify for these. So they're utility rated. So Wisconsin Focus on Energy, many of you have probably heard of it, statewide program that offers rebates and incentives for energy efficiency and renewable projects. And we're actually chatting on the way over here. There's also some design assistance that is there, and some other focus on energy programs that might be available. So the utilities are the partners. They're the ones that fund it. All of our utility providers here in Wisconsin are in on it. And FIAS certification can be deemed as a compliant pathway. And many states have programs like this, Massachusetts yet again. And there's also another type of mechanism that's called the utility bill-backed tariff financing. So it's the pay-as-you-save type program. So it's not a loan officially, but basically the utility funds the upgrades which are repaid on utility bills. So Arkansas, Kansas, and New Hampshire are all doing this, or have some sort of program that will. And then there's other incentives. City of Madison Sustainability has some incentives. I hope that you all are talking to Madison folks and Middleton folks, which I'll mention again soon. I think that, collaborating and kind of working together to figure this out might be useful. And then Colorado also has a affordable housing rebate program that's single family. Low-income housing tax credits, I think everyone's familiar with those. They will continue to exist. They are in place currently, and my understanding is that they will continue. So it's a federal program that provides the funding, but then it's administered by the state. So in our case, it's WIDA. WIDA added FIAS certification in 2024, 2025, and our FIAS Alliance chapter was actually integral into that, so it's a point of pride for us. More than 20 states have included the FIAS standard in their QAPs, and if you don't know, QAP is kind of like their way of rating a building, gaining points to determine how much funding you will get. And from my understanding from the folks over at FIAS is that multifamily has grown significantly in the states where there is a QAP. And just looking at this map, and thinking about all the things that are going on in Massachusetts, I can verify that appears to be true. They have a lot of low-income housing that is FIAS certified. And then, according to FIAS, cost data that shows developers, designers, and builders are executing FIAS projects at a low incremental cost as experience increases. So that's really key. You know, you do one and you learn a lot. And then you do the second one and you learn a little bit more. And by the third or fourth one, you're kind of feeling like you got this. So it's really important to understand that like the cost, incremental cost can actually go down as your team gets better at implementing. And then there's municipal financial mechanisms. PACE is one. There's a C-PACE program that is a commercial property tax assessment financing. Milwaukee has an example. There is a PACE Wisconsin that might be worth looking into. And specific to commercial examples would be New York City, Massachusetts, and Colorado. And then there are revolving loan funds where a city seeds a loan pool that finances high performance upgrades and repayments refill the fund. So Ann Arbor is doing this, Minneapolis is doing this, and actually Boulder County is doing this. And the first time I learned about this was actually from a woman from Harvard University, and they've been doing this for 2 or 3 decades now, where they have this little revolving loan fund. And, you know, they build a building, and then as the building has operational savings, that loan fund is replenished for the next building. And then finally, green bank partnerships. I know very little about this, but this was on the list of financing mechanisms that Isaac over at FIAS shared with me. So it's the idea that city partners with the state or regional green bank to co-finance high-performance projects, and Connecticut, New York, and Michigan are participating in this kind of thing. Green bonds are another option. Cities can issue municipal bonds and dedicated process to certify affordable housing, zero energy public buildings, or electrification retrofits. Again, New York City is on this list, DC is also on this list, and Massachusetts as usual. And then property tax abatements for high performance buildings, which is partial property tax relief for buildings that meet the verified performance thresholds. And Chicago and Cleveland and New York City are all doing this. And then finally TIF, I think everybody knows what TIF is. You can actually capture the increased property tax revenue through a new development, using it to fund public improvements or some sort of incentive for certification. And then there's non-financial incentives for municipalities, density, FAR, height bonuses. Middleton is actually trying this out. So I would absolutely encourage you to talk to Middleton. They are working on a pilot with Slipstream, is my understanding. And I believe what it is that you get an extra floor if you go for FIAS certification. So this is a pretty straightforward mechanism that you can be using and probably have the ability to implement fairly quickly. Somerville, Massachusetts, and also Vancouver in Canada are doing this. Expedited permitting and priority review, I think this is something you keep in your back pocket. We don't have a lot of issues with long permitting in Madison or Fitchburg or our communities around here, but someday we might. Seattle and San Francisco, like San Francisco, it's a year or more to get a permit on something, so keeping it in the back pocket for future reference is good. Other zoning relief options like parking reductions, setback bulk, lot coverage, flexibility, you know, like is it okay if you cover a lot a little bit more because your building is FIAS certified? And then envelope thickness exemptions, you know, the envelopes do tend to get a bit thicker. You know, would it be okay if they encroached on the lot line by 2 inches so that they, you know, can get a FIAS building built and still make it viable financially? And then of course, public recognition or preferred status. I think anybody who is a developer and manages to pull off a FIAS certified building would welcome some publicity and some preferred status. And I think that other developers may fall in line when they see that one is getting that credit. And then codes and alternate pathways. Before I talk too much about this, I do want to say that there's a difference in how we adopt codes. in the state of Wisconsin, we adopt it by state. So the state adopts it, everybody follows it, all municipalities. It is not allowed for any municipality to require a code that is more stringent than the one that we've adopted. This is different than like Illinois, for example. They adopt code by municipality. So some municipalities have no code. Some municipalities can have a much more stringent code, like they're doing in Chicago. So I just want to say that, like, you cannot require anyone to go past code, but you can incentivize them. So you can establish an alternative code compliance path, or you could pass some sort of green building ordinance that's 100% voluntary. But at least it gives people sort of guidance on what and how to do these things. And it also can be tied to a financial or non-financial incentives. So Chicago and Washington, Oregon, Denver, and Boulder County, and Massachusetts are all implementing some sort of alternative path like what I just described. And then just as a quick review, Wisconsin codes, like where are we at? Right now, single family, we're basically on the 2009 version of the National Energy Code. We're pretty behind. I am actually on the committee that is working to improve this and to update our residential codes. So stay tuned for more on that. Commercial, we just changed from 2015 to 2021. I think that's a critical step towards higher performance. I'm glad that we did that. We have to continue on these code cycles because I think as we will see, codes will just become more advanced and lead us to the place where we want to go, which for me is net zero. And then finally, there's this piece, this valuation, appraisal, sort of MLS, the market infrastructure. Right now, we do not have a way to make energy efficiency financially legible. If you look at an MLS sheet, for example, nowhere on there does it necessarily say, this is a FIA certified building or, all electric or HERS rating. Like, it doesn't say that on there. And there's really no way for appraisers to assign a value to that right now. It all comes down to comps. If you're looking at, for example, a house that my recent company that I was at, we built and finished last year, 2024 now. The owner was having trouble finding comps that matched what he was doing. There was a lot of houses available in the area that were comparable in terms of size, but him and his wife invested in energy efficiency, so that did increase the cost. I mean, first of all, it's a custom home, so that's one thing, but then it also increased the cost, some of the energy efficiency stuff. So in order to find comps in your market, it gets a little bit tricky, but if we were actually valuing and listing the energy efficiency of our buildings, it'd be easier for underwriters to kind of get a hold of some comps that represent the project that you're trying to finance. And I'm not saying that City of Fitchburg has the ability to change that necessarily. I'm just trying to get it into everyone's heads that this is a piece of the whole where we need to see some improvements, whatever we can do to make that a little bit better. Having said that, there are cities that are doing some things like requiring energy disclosures at sale, like Chicago, Twin Cities, New York, and also folks that are doing green MLS, like in Colorado. They've been doing that for several years, actually. And they're also offering training for appraisers and underwriters and lenders. So as an industry, we all kind of have to get there together. And education. So who needs the education? Focus on Energy, like I mentioned earlier, does have some incentives for, or some money for design assistance as an example. But I think that everybody needs a little bit of something, right? Planning staff, how do you write a workable ordinance? Building inspectors, plan reviewers, how do you permit one of these buildings? builders and tradespeople. How do you build it? Like, what are the things we need to know? Like, how do we make it not scary? How do we make it so that when someone sees it, they're like, no, this is normal. I'm not gonna just, add $100,000 to my bid because I don't know what this is. Developers, how do you finance it? That's huge. And then architects, engineers, and consultants, how do we design it? How do we model it? So we all need a little bit of help so we can all get there together. And examples of workforce training or FIAS training subsidies include Denver, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. Partnerships too. I encourage everyone to start reaching out. There's no reason that any one person or any one committee needs to know all the things. Utilities providing rebates and energy modeling and other assistance. There's LIHTC as a housing authority, the CPACE, commercial PACE loans and green banks, partnering with developers, even realtor associations and builders association. Like what do you need builders to what are the obstacles that are in front of you and how can we help remove them? Community colleges and trade schools, Madison College, all of the carpenters who are coming out of that program take a building science class. That's a really great start. Other municipalities across the country, I think, could be, very helpful to have some conversations with about what they're doing. FIAS, so the policy team is headed up by Isaac Elnacave, and I've been talking to him a lot over the past year, trying to get my head around this subject of incentives and both financial and non-financial. And then Slipstream, they're a Focus on Energy partner. They provide technical assistance, training, education, R&D, a lot of really smart people over there that can help you out. So what is the potential path for Fitchburg? I know that you have been working on this. You've put some plans in place. I would encourage everyone to start learning about, what are all these tools that we discussed today? What partnerships can we leverage? What's feasible and on what timeline? Can we do a pilot project? What is Middleton doing? How's it going? And then developing a plan or building on your plan and implementing those changes. So for more information about passive buildings, you can go to the FIAS website, which is listed here. If you're interested in learning more about any of the topics we talked about today, or you're looking for a certain presenter in a certain category, please get in touch. There's our email there of the FIAS Alliance chapter. And if you want to get on our mailing list, and there's LinkedIn, we post things on there. And then, yes, thank you again for having us. I'm available for questions. Sean is here. He's available for questions too, coming at it from someone on a team who actually implemented one of these buildings. And thank you very much.
Christy, thank you so much. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. I'll open it up to questions from the committee. Dave and Logan, please use your digital hands. I can see you if you do want to ask a question. Anyone would like to go first? Bill? I assume you.
So how many developers in the area have expressed any interest in passive buildings? And I'm also looking at Ned back there.
I can think of a couple. Some of the developers we work with are very interested in it, but I know there's a development in Middleton who's toying with passive principles, and some of her development there's adjacent to the Bayville Community Center down on the old Greenbush neighborhood. They're working on another adjacent building. So that developer, she's looking to get certified. So it's growing. We're still very niche mentality in this state, but it's exciting to see more people are looking at it as actually a viable means to build.
One question I have is, as you have those four main principles of the design. Now, if a building does some of that, they have better insulation or better windows, but they don't do all of it, does that create any sort of issue where you actually do some detriment to the building because you're creating problems because you created a better envelope, but you missed this piece of it?
I mean, certainly you wouldn't get certification if you weren't able to meet all those, but I do think it is a little bit dangerous not to consider them all at once. For example, if you were going to do airtightness, like I'm gonna make my building really, really airtight, but I'm not gonna do ventilation. You're gonna have people in that building that are having high CO2 levels, headaches at night, or inability to concentrate and things like that, sickness. So you wouldn't wanna make a building very airtight and then not introduce fresh air, for example. I also think that it's hard to decouple the airtightness from the insulation. Those things really do work together to prevent heat loss. So I think you'd be hard pressed to not, I guess I wouldn't recommend only taking one or two
So
without considering the whole.
So if you're doing passive elements, you're likely taking into account everything. I'm curious because we're building a police facility right next door, and we put a ton of sustainability elements into it, including what we were talked about as passive elements, especially with the building envelope. So I'm curious, I don't think we are pursuing any certification. Do you know, Chad? I didn't hear anything about that, so I would assume
Are
we
we,
would have talked
are we
about
doing
that.
LEED?
No, we are not doing LEED. It is to a large extent cost prohibitive. It was going to be several $100,000s to get that certification, although we are doing a number of concepts that would qualify for building certification through LEED, including solar, geothermal, as well as a significantly enhanced building envelope.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think if I can't go for a certification, it's not something that we're gonna do. We're not gonna meet it, we're not gonna get all the way there. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't, look at your envelope and go ahead and make improvements on it. Also, under the commercial code, you do need ventilation. So as long as you're, designing to our current code, you will have some ventilation.
Yeah, actually, and that just changed in the most recent code change with commercial construction. They are requiring fresh air exchange.
I think the police facility has 4 ERVs in it or something.
I don't recall.
Well, one thing that the architects, they presented to the Resource Conservation Commission, and one of the things they did was they actually backed off on some insulation on parts of it. And I asked them what they were doing there, and they said, well, the modeling showed that during certain, the shoulder seasons or the summer, I don't remember exactly what was going on, but they said that given the number of people inside generating heat, having the extra insulation was actually a detriment. And I was a little dubious, and I wonder if you have an opinion on that.
I feel like saying more insulation is a detriment is probably not right. Having said that, there is this moment of the diminishing returns, right? So just backing up, what energy model are they using? I don't know what they're using. But it is very possible that what they were seeing is correct. So once you insulate a building and air seal it and all of this, the people actually provide a lot more heat than you would think. And also computers and electronics and things like that. So it might be possible, but it's hard to speak to without seeing the specifics.
I think my first question to them would be, are they planning on not air conditioning the building? Because insulation works both ways. And so if I would assume, yes, they are air conditioning the building. And therefore, if you're losing that cooling to the exterior because of, reduced insulation levels, you're spending more to condition that air.
Plus, we're in Wisconsin. We're going to spend, 2 or 3 times the energy on heating as we will cooling.
Yes, what's interesting though, as you design better insulated buildings and better solar, facing buildings and thinking about tuning glass, it is true that you are controlling cooling costs can be harder than heating costs. And yes, I think I agree with you that we generally still spend more on heating than cooling, but it's harder to cool down a passive building in some ways because computers and people and, your refrigerator is a heating element in your house, so all those things contribute to that effect on your building. And if you have a really tight envelope and you happen to be facing south and you're getting some solar gain, yeah, you can overheat. But I think there are the diminishing returns, like Christy had the example of the knee that you could see, that there is definitely a sweet spot of insulation. So more isn't always better, but it's one thing that's really interesting about FIAS is that these aren't just like kind of guesses. These are based in science, based on a lot of research. Like there are, this is now has grown into a very, rigid standard, and they hold that, very close. Like they don't just give out the certification because they have a name to represent. And so so I'd be curious what those architects were looking at. And I mean, to go back to Gabriella, your kind of question, there are, I think, hybrids there before you get to like the Gold Star FIAS certification. And one of the most often overlooked ones for low-hanging fruit is glazing, either through exterior shading elements or triple pane. The upgrade to triple pane a window, which is you're getting 30% more insulation value or U factor in the window with pretty minimal investment. You might increase your labor costs a little bit, but you're getting quite a impact on comfort and just energy efficiency, because the weakest link in this room right here is all of these massive windows. I mean, you might have an R30 wall, but these are R5 windows, and so if you can increase that to an R7, I mean, you've definitely exponentially increased your the savings and the comfort in the space. So you can go deeper into like why it's important to consider holistically as you get deeper into it, but there are small moves that you can make that I think are worth considering.
The other thing is there's this notion in the single-family residential pretty good house. So it's people who absolutely have bought into the principles of passive building, but they're not necessarily going for certification, and the house is pretty good. What you're missing, though, is a couple things. One, you don't have the third-party verification, which is really critical, which is one of my main criticisms of LEED. We didn't always, I used to be a LEED consultant as well, and we didn't always have that proof at the end that the building was operating as planned, whereas here you do with FIAS. The other thing is incentives, right? Like if you're going to tie incentives to some sort of certification, what is it if it's not FIAS?
Megan?
If I were to build like a single family home, my house, like with these principles, are there additional maintenance items over time, wear and tear items, things that have to be kept up, I guess, to maintain that over time? That would be different from just building a regular house.
I'll let Sean answer that too, but I would say no, because the siding's the same and the mechanical systems are still there. You could argue that maybe the mechanical system you choose needs less maintenance, but what are you doing in most of your houses? I mean, we're changing a furnace filter, we're giving it a checkup. I mean, all those same things would apply. And once the windows are in and the insulation are in, I mean, I think that's kind of where the passive term came from. They're there passively doing their job.
Yeah, I mean, first thing coming to mind would be almost every passive building. I mean, I would argue every building should have what's called an ERV, which is it's a fancy bath fan that's also drawing fresh air in, and so they're exchanging the heat and some of the humidity between those air streams without actually passing the air streams over each other. And why that's important is that we have an ERV at our office, and the other day when it was negative 20 degrees outside, I took my thermal camera just because it's fun to look at thermal imaging, and literally getting negative 20 degree air into our office on the intake. So there's four pipes. That negative 20 degree air was entering into this heat exchanger, and then as it went through the heat exchanger, it was being crossed over with 80 degree interior temperature air. So that interior air now was leaving our office at closer to like 20 degrees. And what was coming into our furnace was close to 50 degrees. And so we were literally using the heat that would normally be exhausted out of your building and using that to preheat the fresh air. So we're getting fresh air into our building. That being said, in so doing, I was like, oh, I haven't changed these filters in like 3 months. So every 3 months, I would recommend changing your filters. That's a simple maintenance thing, but highly worth it because it's you're increasing the quality of your experience in the building. I think there is an argument that passive buildings tend to be built more durable. You're thinking through, all of your control layers in a deeper way, and so I would argue that a passive building will probably be more resilient to maintenance if it's built correctly, and usually they're done with a higher level of care. So in theory, you're replacing, your maintenance costs on the envelope should be less because you're not potentially getting condensation issues that might cause window sills to rot out or moisture issues that that might turn up in a building that wasn't thoughtfully built. That is it guaranteed? No, but I think that the care that you put into a passive envelope is going to stand up longer than a code-built house for sure.
I'm curious about insulated concrete form homes, and are those like naturally a passive building, or is that a completely different thing?
It depends. It's all in the details, right?
Yeah.
That's definitely an option, right? So like FIAS, a passive building doesn't have to use a certain type of assembly, right? It's as long as you meet the loads and the electricity benchmarks, you can kind of do it however you want. So that's absolutely like a viable way to do one. Do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, ICF construction is interesting. And if people don't know what that means, it's usually 2.5 inches of foam, 8 inches of concrete, 2.5 inches of foam. So and to Chris's point, almost any type of assembly can be made into a passive house. I mean, they're actually pretty. It's important to think that way. It's not like one. There are pros and cons to almost any wall assembly, but that particular assembly, one of the values in that assembly is, there's 5 inches of foam there, but trapping that thermal mass inside is okay. But if that thermal mass could be, utilized inside the building, that the sun hits the concrete floor or a wall, then it's actually radiating that heat and then holding it versus being trapped in a wall. So it's like I think it's definitely doable to make a high performance house out of it. It's the people I know who've done it are more like, well, they're in the concrete industry and they really like making concrete walls, or it is kind of like a Lego type of building product, so it's pretty easy for non-trade people to put together. It still takes some skill, but I don't know if inherently I would say it's the way I would do it, but.
And then do you have a sense of like how much more expensive a passive, is it like 10% more expensive than a conventional build, 20%? Like, is there like a general rule of thumb? Obviously, I know that varies wildly, and maybe it's different for residential versus commercial, but I mean, maybe you could talk about 252 Dunning and how much more expensive is that?
It's a great question. I mean,
In single family versus multifamily.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for Dunning, for example, is a 32-unit multifamily building in Madison built last year. I mean, we probably put a number between 6% and 8% premium. Okay. There are some of the ways we were able to reduce that, because I mean, originally when we were budgeting it, and it was coming in at 10, 12%, and it wasn't a viable project at that overage. But some of the ways to get the price more cost parity is to really keep all of the traditional trades doing traditionally what they do and concentrating the weird stuff to a smaller group, so that you don't have kind of fear pricing. You don't have people that are like, well, I've never done it like that, I'm just going to throw another 20% on. And so it's education, it's designing assemblies that the electrician just does what the electrician always does. So he's not putting a premium cost on it. And then, so when your premium goes into is you and by using the tool, passive house consultant tools, you're doing energy modeling in the building to maximize the glazing, maximize the amount of R value you need in the building so that you're not overspending on things and you're getting that sweet spot. I think that I know builders out west that are looking at more 3 to 5%. And it starts to get really interesting and those are done partly because you're having a larger pool of trade contractors that aren't at all afraid of this. You can get those numbers down through scale. I know some developers who wouldn't even think about building a 32-unit building. I mean, that code build is just not profitable for them. So there's a scale factor that I think you can look into. There's relationships between form, like Christy's slide on, that simple graphic of like, you take a notch out of the building on the north and you put it on the south, you just increased your wall section by 20%. We were able to get certification at Dunning with the undulations in that building. We had Urban Design Commission kind of weigh in on how that building looked, so that affected us. This is a very backwards way to design a building to be a passive building, but we were stuck with the form, and we couldn't really change that once we went to certify the building. Normally, you would plan on certifying a building and then design the form. I think it's cool the way it turned out because it isn't just a simple box. So you have a little more design interest, but so I think that those couple of things. Taking away the fear through education and trying to scale and thinking about how to make these to simplify those systems. I think if we did it again, I would, and I argued a very different wall system to this, which was actually potentially 20% less than this type of wall assembly we chose to do this. But because this was the first one the builder did, this is a very safer wall assembly, and that's much deeper conversation in building science. But there's a whole range. Your ICF question, that's a great, actually fairly economic way to build. This was on the higher end of wall assemblies in terms of how it was done, but was chosen because it's a very safe way from a condensation risk. So it's kind of comfort,
We brought up ICF a couple times. I just want to point out that neither foam nor concrete is good for the environment. And so how does the embodied carbon in the concrete and the fact that foam will eventually end up in a landfill somewhere most likely, how does that play into, how do you play that versus the savings in energy that the building is going to have across its lifetime?
Okay.
For me, my personal approach is to avoid those things as much as I can. Sometimes we can't avoid foam, like thinking about a below grade situation. We're not going to put cellulose down there, for example, but people have used mineral wool and things like that. I've done homes with no slab, like it's a slab on grade that has no slab. Developing a system of, in this case, foam, but it could be another product, and building up the floor system and putting 2 layers of plywood and some wood flooring on top of that. So I think, and then anything above grade, as much as humanly possible, I'm choosing products that have a lower global warming potential. So cellulose, for example, dense pack cellulose, if you can get a good, nice, dense pack in your walls, that's going to be a really great wall system. So I would always choose that over foam if I could. For exterior insulation, there's mineral wool. You could debate, whether or not that's a good thing. It's a byproduct of, cold slag. So I guess it really kind of depends on the situation, but it's something that I am personally trying to balance in my design work, but it's not necessarily part of FIAS protocol or anything. Mm-hmm. Chad?
And what about modular homes? Is there any possibility for modular homes to use passive elements, or is that just given, because I know that's a trend, that's been a lot of discussion right now.
Yeah, so I think the thing that I've seen I've had people be like, look at this one, it's really cool, and it's from California, or it's from Pacific Northwest, and they have totally different climate zone. So I think it's important to select either a floor plan that you're buying or an actual home that you're buying that is meant to I know I have talked to a few different people out east that are doing modular homes and trying to incorporate these higher levels of insulation and figuring out ways to have air tightness, even though they're modular and they come in pieces and you stick them together. But it's not something that, I don't feel like it's something that has ramped up as much as I thought it might. People are still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I think you could argue it's similar to this idea that computers make life so perfect that we don't have to work anymore, or robots are going to clean our houses, or AI is going to solve all of our problems. Modular is really interesting, but I think if you saw how panelization of most modern buildings get put together and how quickly a panelized system goes, it's like I took a time lapse of Dunning, for example, and to watch that building go from a hole in the ground to a finished building, it's amazing how quickly it goes up, right? And you watch, these panels are built in a factory, so it's sheeted, framed and sheeted, waterproofed, brought on site, dropped with a crane. An entire, like each floor of this building was, built in a week. You could modularize that in like a shipping container type of brick, bring it onto site. But now you have to deal with interconnecting all of the plumbing and the electrical. You have to deal with how does the inspectors, like if that was built in Chicago, brought to Madison, how does that work? The cost, in theory, it would be less because you're building in a environment in a factory, but all of the other things that go into a building, like the corridors and the finishes and the flooring, in theory, you can do all of that. So I think we're not there. I'm not saying, I'm just speaking with skepticism because I think that there are other ways to achieve that efficiency, and we're kind of doing it already in modern commercial construction with panelization, but it's not really thought of. It's either like, you're cutting all the wood on site, or you're building in a factory. And I think that the hybrid is that sweet spot right now. Now there is I know there's a company in Maine that's doing modularization, offering very limited floor plans, and they're doing passive level building. They're insulating their walls before they leave the factory. So there's some really interesting stuff going on there. I think that's still quite a premium though, in terms of like we tried to how did we make this as simple as possible on a building like this? And it was through getting scrappy and finding ways to save, even though we're also really respecting building science and not cutting any corners and risk. And I think, and there is an interesting balance, Bill, to your question on source energy versus operational energy. And it's not exact, I think in general, a building's going to use a lot more operational energy than it ever will with source. But that gets true. If you build it right, yeah. But if you're putting a bunch of foam and concrete into a building, yes, those are high embodied energy products. Yeah. So there is a sweet spot there, and there's a whole another level you can go there in terms of getting rid, really reducing your carbon or going carbon negative with buildings. That's a whole other conversation we can talk about outside of that. But yes, in general, rock wool is what was the main source of insulation on this for the walls, but the floor and the roof was still foam, traditional. A lot more than tradition, but there's to reduce operation.
Donald?
So thank you for the presentation and learning about all this. I just have a question around, given how some of the rents that you saw for the previous properties that you did, are there opportunities for municipalities or for you all to seek maybe, grants or some type of subsidies to bring the cost of these types of sustainable buildings down and make them more affordable, or to have some affordable units inside one of these buildings where they're not all at market rate, but still making it, of course, profitable for us to build things like this in the community?
Yeah. All of the financing mechanisms that I went through is what I'm aware of right now that would assist with that. So it kind of depends. If it's a low-income housing project, then that's a whole different thing, right? You're going through WIDA. But if it's market rate, you're probably going to have to get a little more creative and look at some of these other incentives to bring the costs down.
Can we mix them? All right.
I think it's a great question. I mean,
Yeah.
and there's something I think, I mean, recently the change in single metering of building, is really interesting, right? So if you can, and we tried to do this at Dunning, but this was a couple years ago, but just this year now, you could take a building and, like a building like this, again, we did the math, and 32-unit building, it's about $10,000 a year just in paying to have the privilege to have a hookup to the electrical meter, right? So if you could provide, if this building could be single metered, and then you could take that savings and you could put that into, reducing rents. That's, to me, that's like a no-brainer, simple way. Like there's a lot of different ways you could look at doing that. And then in one simple way to control that is like, okay, so now the landlord pays all of the utility bills. And let's say you got to make sure people also are respecting that. Okay, you can't just leave the window open all winter long. Okay, if you exceed a certain level, a monthly payment, then you might have to pay the difference or something. But I know previous to this public, commission change, I think I can only think of one or two buildings, and they were more transitional housing type facilities that were allowed to do this because it. I mean, just that simple move alone makes a big difference. But Rethke Terrace is a good example of, again, transitional housing where they super insulated the building, and now their operational costs are less because they're paying less to heat and cool the building, Yeah, so I think there's a huge advantage to thinking about this from reducing operational energy, which means that people can live there for cheaper, right?
Mm-hmm. I would also add that all the presentations that I've seen at the VS conferences of people who are doing multifamily and sort of paving the way for all of this, not necessarily in Wisconsin yet, right? Because we're trying to pave the way. But they would have very long lists of things that they combined. If you're in Massachusetts, you have a lot of resources at your disposal. There's so many different programs that I listed on the slides, and they would be pulling from different pieces of that, depending on what kind of building they were building. I would definitely look at VS. VS has done a lot to help developers kind of crack this nut. They've had things like developers hootenannies where people get together and they learn from each other. And there's many presentations online and also certain projects that might align with a project that is being considered here in Fitchburg, for example, that you could reach. I mean, this community is they are arms open all the time. So definitely willing to sit down with people and help them through it and figure it out.
I'd like to wrap it up soon, so maybe one more question. Anyone? Bill?
Are there libraries that you can pull from, here's a design, it's passive house ready, here's exactly how to build it, so boom. You don't have to do any of that hard design work up yourself because somebody has already gone through it.
Are you talking about single family or larger projects like a commercial project?
Well, so for instance, you mentioned if you could do Dunning over, you would make a few changes, whatever. So let's say you did a second building very similar to it and you refined it somewhat. And maybe when you get to the third one, you say, all right, I feel pretty good that people could just take this design and drop it in any city with a similar climate. And that would save them, I'm assuming, a bundle of money.
I think for the commercial buildings and multifamily, it sounds so awesome to be able to do that. And maybe if all of your sites were wide open and you didn't have zoning restrictions or setbacks and things like that, then that would work. But so often we're nowadays having to build in tight urban sites. So, form follows function. You have to kind of respond to all of the zoning requirements, utility requirements, all of those sort of restrictions that are on the site. So I'm not aware of any that exist out there, but there are some people that are starting to do single family homes as a design package that you could buy. And again, I mean, you face the same questions there with zoning and things like that, but I think you're more likely to be able to work with a single family home design that's already pre-engineered for our climate. The other thing is solar orientation, right? Like the first thing I do when I come across a project, I'm like, where's the sun, right? Granted, sometimes you can do a building without any solar. Sometimes we have a situation where all the best views are to the north and don't really have any good views at all to the south, or we don't have solar access. So we have to make up for it with additional insulation or things like that. But it's hard to think about sometimes if you have, like I said, if you have just kind of sprawling rural site that you can just kind of plunk your building whatever which way you want to, that might be fine. But it gets a little more constricted when you're in the city.
I know FIAS has started their detail library. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but, so it's not a whole building, but it's definitely a place where they've said, hey, we know this works in this assembly, which gets you faster to that tracking. But I think the only thing to add is WUFI modeling. I mean, every building is going to need.
Oh, yeah, WUFI model, that's the energy model that is built as part of Passive House.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Yeah,
We really
thanks for
appreciate
having
your
us.
time, and we have your contact information, and thank you so much. It was really fascinating.
Great, thank you.
All right, next item is announcements. Our next committee of the whole meeting will be February 25th, 2026, next month. We are looking to start potentially at 5:30 p.m., so please let us know if that's an issue. Chad, do you want to share a little bit about what we'll discuss?
Yeah, we are hoping to have a conversation with a joint meeting actually with the village board from Oregon. And it's our, in anticipation of receiving a presentation and forthcoming report from Jason Valerius and the Capital Area Regional Planning Commission in regards to potential development interests in southeast Fitchburg, just north of the village of Oregon.
Should be a really interesting meeting. If there are no questions, all right, we'll move on. I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Oh, I'm sorry, Logan had a question.
Gabriella,
Yeah.
I was just going to ask if that meeting is going to be in our council chambers or if that would be in Oregon.
The plan is to have it in Oregon, I believe.
Yeah, we're looking at the Oregon Public Library.
Okay, thank you.
Keep an eye on your email. We'll let you know when we have that finalized. We have a motion on the floor to adjourn.
Motion, second.
All right, we got it.
Second, yeah.
All in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Aye.
We are adjourned at 8:02 p.m. Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Crosby.
And I'm Nick Boucher. We're your hosts for the program that's all about your city, Talking Fitchburg.
Every weekday, we pull together the news, events, and information you need to stay on top of what's happening in the city of Fitchburg.
Find Talking Fitchburg on cable TV.